Good morning, everyone. This reading is coming from Topeka once again. I was carried gently by Southwest Airlines yesterday. Got back home at 11 p.m. To be honest, that's a little past my bedtime, especially since it was midnight on my internal clock, having been reset by my 2 months in the Eastern time zone. But okay, does us good to reset the time clock once in a while. We don't want to have internal time clocks taking over our lives completely. Could that be the subject of a poem? Well, I haven't written one like that. Maybe someone will. You may recall last week that I said, lamentably, the audience for poetry is the same as the number of people writing poems. I should have said, understandably. Look at it this way. If you like reading poems and you have difficulty breaking bad habits, sooner or later you will write poems. Then you're really hooked. Now, that doesn't happen if you like to read novels. I don't think I was ever inspired to write a novel after reading War and Peace, or even Huckleberry Finn, or any one of a number of others, including the Horatio Hornblower lengthy series of books when I was a kid. So the number of novel readers is much higher than the number of novel writers. This fact is reinforced every time I see my 2-volume edition of the Viking collection of English poetry. It begins with a translation of part of Beowulf, which would have been written between 600 and 800 AD, and then through Chaucer, which I can read but will not subject you to my version, and ends with Robert Burns 625 pages later. Well, then comes volume 2. This begins with Wordsworth and ends with Dylan Thomas and Robert Lowell. I bought the set in 1958. But just imagine how much poetry has come since then. It boggles the mind. That's a cliche, but for you cliche haters out there, I want to remind you that somebody once said that a cliche becomes a cliche because it is true. Oh, I almost forgot. We are here to read poetry. All of us probably have read poems with swans, which are perhaps the most beautiful birds of all. But I'm going to read today a poem by Ruth Schwartz called The Swan at Edgewater Park. And this poem teaches some important things, not necessarily internally within the poem, but about how poems are and probably should be created. The Swan at Edgewater Park isn't one of your prissy rich people's swans. Wouldn't be at home on some pristine pond, chooses the whole stinking shoreline, candy raptors, condoms in its tidal fringe, prefers to curve its muscular, slightly grubby neck into the body of a great lake, swilling whatever its swans swill. Chardonnay of algae with bouquet of crud, while Clevelanders walk by saying, "Look at that big duck." Beauty isn't the point here, of course. The swan is beautiful, but not like Laurie at 16, when everything was possible. No, more like Laurie at 27, smoking away her days off in her dirty kitchen her kid with asthma watching TV, the boyfriend who doesn't know yet she's going to dump him, washing his car out back, and he's a runty little guy and drinks too much, and it's not his kid anyway. But he loves her. He really does. He loves them both. That's the kind of swan this is. Well, think about that for a minute. The persona who is the reader or the writer, the person that's telling the story of the swan at Edgewater Park, the persona suddenly changes the poem in the middle. And we're talking about the swan, and then all of a sudden we're hearing about Laurie at 16 when everything was possible. No more like Laurie at 27, smoking away her days off in her dirty kitchen. In other words, all of a sudden a new character is introduced, and shortly after that, the kid with asthma, and then in the next line, the boyfriend who doesn't know she's going to leave him, and then a little description of him, and he loves them both. And the final line is, that's the kind of swan this is. The poet is taking us back to the swan who has chosen to live in the dirty pond. And the swan is like these people who have chosen to create and live in their own dirty pond. So this is a kind of gritty poem. It's not the kind of poem everyone likes, but it's a very cleverly written poem, and it is a poem that uses the mechanism of changing the subject, or we think it's changing the subject right in the middle, introduces new subject matter, and then uses this new subject matter to tie itself to the first subject, which was the swan. And it's telling us how many people, just like some swans, choose to live in less than ideal circumstances, and it seems to be their own choice. Nobody's saying here that Laurie has been abused by anybody or who and that she didn't make her own choices. And the same can be said about the swan. The swan chose to live in the dirty pond instead of in the pristine pond. Well, I think you get the idea here that complexity in poems is something that turns us off at times, but if we look carefully at the poem, we begin to see a lot of messages there, and I think that's good. I think we need to look for poems like that once in a while. Now, next I'm going to read a poem called Downsizing by Janet Jenkins Stotts. And it's kind of predictive, I guess, because she wrote this poem a long time ago, but right now she and her husband have just completed moving to Brewster Place, where I live. And I'm surprised that she decided, after writing this poem, to move once more. This poem is called Downsizing. Downsizing, so trendy, ecologically correct, and financially prudent, but the reality is millions of decisions. Each possession must be judged, weighing use against nostalgia, not just chairs and beds, but teaspoons and photograph albums. His father's gilded framed Kentucky Colonel certificate versus my father's Art Deco headshot, saturnine and young, paid for by working every free hour to hide his family's poverty. Chairs brought to Kansas in a covered wagon against an oak table made from the boards of his great-grandfather's coffin, used for the funeral before interring him in a winding sheet under the sod of the treeless plain. Like the hardy roses left behind, our lives are pruned. Dead wood is trimmed, discarded, the vital rootstock of our past laid bare, thorns blunted by time and love. Yes, and you'll notice that Janet, in this poem, Downsizing, she makes some generalized comments about downsizing and its difficulties. And then she takes us back to the past and points out that some of these items, which would not be considered worth much in their own state of being, came from the boards of his great-grandfather's coffin. Her chairs were brought to Kansas in a covered wagon. All of this is important, and it really describes the difficulties of deciding what to carry with you through life and what to leave behind. I've gone through this myself, and who knows, I may again. So I'm very sympathetic to the poem Downsizing, and I certainly thank Janet for writing it. It's a very, very valuable and insightful poem. It's from her book, Winter's Yield. Well, it's rainy and windy outside this morning. I'm getting ready to go exercise, which is the reason for my get up this morning. I'm not about to brave the weather. I'll be on a treadmill and doing a few other things that I'm told will make me live forever. What a joke that is. And wouldn't the world be a crowded place? We can't have that. Seriously, though, you'll see me again next week on this gig, at which time I'm minded to read some of Wordsworth and maybe a Victorian poet or two. We need to change of pace ever so often. I try to give you one almost every week. I hope you appreciate that. We'll see. And remember, I always love to hear your preferences, and I might even honor them at times. Goodbye, and God go with you.